It's good to see you, Daniel.
Good morning, Dr. Paul.
Well, there is some exciting news. There's been a move on for a couple years now to have some type of an agreement with the Iranians and sort of breaking the ice, break through, and at least talk to the Iranians, which I always favored and we've talked about. But when I woke up this morning very early from Europe, the president was speaking, talking about reaching, a deal with the Iranians. And this involved 6 major countries, U.S. and UK, France and Germany, as well as China and Russia. Isn't that interesting? I thought we were trying to provoke China and Russia, but they at least sat down and worked this out, and there's a deal. Now, on the surface, it won't be hard to find out who will love the deal. Maybe nobody will love the deal, but at least satisfied with it, and which ones will become nearly hysterical. There is a group of people in this country, I claim they're terrified about peace breaking out. And that, of course, are the radical neocons. And I imagine we've already heard from them. They're probably not going to be too happy with this little agreement.
Well, our favorite Senator Tom Cotton said it was a stunning, historic mistake. And his buddy across the ocean, Bibi Netanyahu, said it would, quote, lead to nuclear war.
I wonder how that will happen when, more so now than otherwise. It seems like if they were very concerned about nuclear weapons breaking out, and they wouldn't go to a country that really they haven't ever proved that they've broken the rules on the Non-Proliferation Treaty. And there are other countries in the Middle East that seem to be antagonistic. Take one for Pakistan. I mean, they're not exactly the calmest country in the world, and they have nuclear weapons. So it's a lot of demagoguing. But what I find interesting is how these players come together. I said that it's surprising that Russia and China joined in on this. But when you think about us working with the Iranians right now, the Iranians are fighting ISIS, and that is good. But we're on the opposite side when they want to get rid of Assad. So this thing just is all mishmash, all over the place. But nobody seems to say, well, we have to just do this and do that, and we'll improvise. If there's a problem here, we'll send troops here, or we'll switch sides. Look how many times they switch sides with the good guys in Syria, with the rebels. One time we're with them, and the next time we're against them.
I was just listening to something the other night. It was a replay of something that President George W. Bush said, which is that the Taliban are a bunch of terrorists. We have no choice but to destroy them. And then someone from this administration said they refused to call them terrorists, and said they were armed fighters or something. So it really is, on the one hand, the U.S. wants to be, or some people in the U.S. want it to be the world hegemon, to tell the rest of the world what to do. But on the other hand, it has no consistent policy. Even if the other countries were willing to follow its every dictate, they wouldn't know what to do from one day to the next.
The president made a good point. I didn't hear the whole speech, but most of it, and read a little bit more about it. But the one point I did listen to him, I thought made good sense. And that was when he was explaining that you don't always just talk to your friends. We don't need to have this conversation with the Canadians. It wouldn't make any sense. You talk to people that are potential enemies or even enemies. And he points out that we had weapons agreements, and Reagan, the champion of the conservatives, worked out deals with the Soviets. The Soviets, not the Russians, the Soviets, and backed off on some of this weaponry. So he was claiming this was a good sign. And I remember very clearly, which I've mentioned many times, is that when in the 1960s I was drafted into the military, but I wasn't exactly unhappy that there was a conversation between Kennedy and Khrushchev, even though there's some pros and cons on exactly the way that conversation went. But the net result was the weapons were taken out, and we made some promises. At the time, the promise was we'd take missiles out of Turkey. And I know they had to keep it secret because they thought the people would go nuts. But logic would say, well, that's not a bad trade-off. Why do we have to have weapons in Turkey? At the same time, we complain about the Soviets having weapons in Cuba. So conversation with these people, it can't hurt. And a little bit of diplomacy, it can't hurt us at all. Now, of course, this isn't the end of it. The Congress, the majority in Congress, I think, are controlled by the neocons and the anti-diplomacy group, and they have sworn practically an oath that they are going to stop it and vote it down. And rightfully, the Congress has a responsibility to come. Some could make an argument, and I think about this, is maybe something like this could have been a treaty. But how do you work with 6 countries on a treaty against UN sanctions and all these other things? You can't do it. So I think that I think this thing, is going to go to the Congress. It'll be interesting to see what happens there.
Well, in a way, the U.S. foreign policy created the problem that you've described, because the U.S. wanting to make it look like the entire world was aligned against Iran, they went to the UN and pushed the UN to adopt sanctions on Iran. So they have to go back to the UN to get those done. The other thing I think that's a danger is that people will misinterpret what happened and think of it as a deal, which has been called a done deal, when in reality it's a process. It's even called the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. So this is a process that will take place over a number of years. It's not, right now this will happen. And I think the people who want to detract and want to scuttle this treaty are going to misinterpret it.
It's a long way from the principles that would be developed between 2 sovereign nations, and the president negotiates and it goes to the Senate for ratification. But we're so far removed from that. This is the best thing we can use in order to move a little bit away from this confrontation. But this has been going on for a long time, and if the American people were honest with themselves, they would have to say, who started this fight? Who started it? Well, we'd have to look at our policies in 1953 and the overthrow of an elected leader in Iran and in installing a very, very vicious dictator, the Shah, and then, of course, which helped radicalize those individuals that said, let's get rid of these puppets, and then the '79 revolution occurred, and that happened. But as the years went on with the use of UN in the last decade or so, we have ratcheted up, more and more sanctions, and sanctions, prohibitions of trade, and, freezing of assets. Do you think they froze like a couple $1,000, a couple $1 million, a couple $100 million? $100 billion with sanctions. If anybody did that, it would be an act of war, and every American would join in and say, and we fight, we go to it. But when a big country does this, it's supposed to be moral and correct, because those are bad people and we are righteous people, and we know exactly what we're doing.
And that's why I think those of us who very highly value the idea of sovereignty and national sovereignty shouldn't be overjoyed about this deal as such. If it moves us further away from war, that's a positive thing. But if you're in favor of sovereignty, Iran has been forced to give up a large amount of its sovereignty in exchange for having these sanctions removed. It will have inspectors running through the country. It'll have to regulate which of the reactors can do how much. It can't enrich to a medical level of isotopes on its own now. So it's given up a lot, even though it is a signatory of the Non-Proliferation Treaty.
Well, that's key. When you deal with international economic issues, like that little minor thing going on in Greece and the European Union, the settlement was, many who are well informed say, the Greeks gave up their sovereignty. So we have these international bodies that we get control, we mislead them, give them bad economic advice, create a lot of credit, put them on the hook, and then when there's a problem, then we demand that the IMF economic policy have to be imposed. If not, we're going to let you just float out to sea. So it is the idea and principle. In that regard, you'd say this is not enhancing national security, but in the meantime, if we can take one step away from, the policy that said, nothing is taken off the tables, implying that if you don't behave, we'd even use a nuke on you. Yeah. And that's been around by the Democrats and the Republicans. So that still exists as well.
Yeah, members of the Institute's board, Flint and Hillary Leverett, who are both professors in Washington, they make a great point. And you mentioned how Obama has talked about we need to talk to our enemies, which is a great point. But they pointed out that even though the Americans have been consistently in favor of dialogue with Iran and even a deal, that Obama's big mistake, they say, is that he never came to the American people and explained why it's to our advantage, our strategic advantage, why we're better off having a deal with Iran and getting rid of this confrontational posture.
Well, I have a theory about that. You know, if he doesn't think that we should know what's in a bill of dealing with medical care and that the people might not be wise enough or intelligent enough to find out what it's all about and make their own decision, they just ram it through. And they use executive orders rather carelessly. So they're elitists in the political sense at the worst, and under the worst circumstances. But, you know, one complaint by the neocons will be, oh, you know, they're going to be able to buy weapons. Well, not for 5 years, I think. It's not like tomorrow they're going to order weapons and they say, yeah, they're going to buy them from the Russians. But you know what? I have a suspicion that there's a few U.S. arms dealer that probably are licking their chops and saying, hey, they're going to get their $100 billion back and we're going to be allowed to sell weapons. In 5 years, maybe we'll start producing, you know, for that. So there could be a little bit of that. I don't think our weapons industry have the scruples to say, oh, no, we'll practice a little bit of our own diplomacy. Why should we make a living selling weapons to people that a lot of people are fearful of?
Yeah, because we're the only ones allowed to sell weapons around the world.
You know,
go ahead. I was going to say, the other thing the neocons will say, when it finally, the realization sets in that, oh no, there's nothing we can do to stop it, here's the last thing they're going to say with their last breath. This just proves that sanctions work. It brought them to the table and brought a deal.
You know, the one thing about what we're dealing with here and the inconsistencies, the inability to look at something precisely based on a principle, is the fact that we have shifted around to accepting the principle of interventionism, both in foreign policy and economic policy. Interventionism is a convenient tool for people to do whatever they want and not have to follow any precise moral imperative, and they can be very pragmatic, and so that you can support the same group, the same country for one war and be opposed to them against another war. Nobody even thinks about it. But interventionism permits this, and this is why the chaos that we have, not only in economics, because we have economic interventionism, but the interventionism on foreign policy has created this monster too. I think sovereignty is an important issue. The most important sovereignty is the sovereignty of the individual, and all rights should be individual, and keep it as close to the individual as possible. But then when you talk about governments, get government as close to home as possible. And then if you have to have a national sovereignty, maybe. But let's not decide that everything has to be done internationally under interventionism, and whoever's in charge, you know, and whoever has the power to regulate things and get the benefits will, you know, deal the cards. I think that's what we're putting up with. The total and final solution to that is for we as Americans to stand up and say, non-intervention is what we want. It is the road to peace and prosperity, and we can't depend on these international organizations and agreements. But in the meantime, the only thing left for us right now is to practice diplomacy. So if we see an opening, a door, a movement in that direction with Iran, that is great. The same thing we can say in a positive way is with Cuba. So those individuals who are terrified with the fact that you might have a little bit of dampening of this confrontation should be called to task, because they're wrong. And I think if we want peace and prosperity, we have to change the nature of our foreign policy. And I, of course, vote for non-interventionist peace and prosperity. I want to thank everybody for tuning in today to the Liberty Report, and please come back soon.